The sky split open at 4:17 in the afternoon, and Daniel Reyes was halfway through changing a bicycle tire on his porch when he looked up and saw God's own ceiling come apart. Didn't crack like lightning. It opened the way a wound opens, slow and wet and certain, a long bright seam pulled from horizon to horizon over the pines. The clouds peeled back from it. Birds went up in a single black panic out of every tree at once and did not come down. He could hear them screaming, all of them, somewhere above the roofline. He stayed kneeling on the porch boards with the tire iron in his hand. He did not move for what felt like a long time and was probably 20 seconds. Then the first ship came through. It was the size of a small mountain laid on its side, and it made no sound at all, which was the part he would remember worst later. A thing that big should have shaken the world. Instead, it slid out of the bright seam like a fish from a slit belly, smooth and slow, and the seam closed behind it without a sigh. The shadow of it crossed his yard. His daughter's bike, the one he was fixing, threw no shadow of its own beneath that bigger dark. He felt the cold of it on his face. "Mara," he said, quiet, because his throat had stopped working right. Then louder into the screen door, "Mara, get out here." She came out drying her hands on a dish towel, and she said his name once, as a question, and then she saw it and she did not say anything else. They stood together on the porch and watched the ship pass over their roof at the speed of a freight train and the size of a city, and they held hands the way people do at funerals, by accident, both of them noticing later. Down the road, the Carlsons' dog began to howl. 2 doors over, somebody dropped a glass on a kitchen floor, and Daniel heard it break clear across the street. That was the first hour. By the second hour, the towns nearest the coasts were gone. By the third hour, the president was on every screen telling the country to stay indoors. By the fourth hour, the Vesh, that was what their own broadcast called them when it came, in a voice that sounded like a man speaking through a long copper pipe full of water, had given humanity a deadline and a single word for everything that would happen if the deadline was not met. The word did not translate. The intent did. By nightfall, the lights had gone out in 3 states, and the long broadcast had gone silent, and Daniel Reyes was sitting on the floor of his daughter's bedroom with his back against her bed, holding the tire iron across his knees, listening to something walk down his street. It walked on more legs than 2. His daughter Leela was 8 and asleep. Mara was on the other side of the bed with a kitchen knife she did not know how to use and a face like she was watching her own funeral from the back row. They did not speak. The thing in the street made a sound that was not exactly a click and not exactly a word, and another thing answered it from farther off, and then both sounds moved away toward the next street over and were gone. He let out the breath he had been holding for a count he had lost track of. "Daniel," Mara whispered. "Daniel, we have to." "I know." "Where do we?" "I know," he said again, and he meant it the way you mean it when you don't. He had been a combat medic in another country, in another life. He had patched 18-year-olds back together in the back of a Humvee, and lost 6 of them anyway, and come home, and tried to forget what a person looked like with the inside on the outside, and he had mostly managed it, working ambulance shifts in a town small enough that the worst thing he saw most weeks was a logging accident. He had thought in the back of his head that the bad part of his life was behind him. He had bought a house on a dirt road, married a woman who laughed at his jokes, and taught his daughter to ride a bicycle in the long flat pasture behind the church. He had been wrong about the bad part. The Vesh came for the cities first because the cities were where the lights were, and the lights were what they could see from orbit. They did not understand yet that the country between the cities was where the people actually lived. They would learn. They would learn slowly and at considerable cost, and by the time they understood it, they would already be losing in a way they could not see, because the thing they had come to take from this planet was a thing they did not have a word for. But on the first night, none of that was true yet. On the first night, the Vesh were winning, and Daniel Reyes sat on the floor of his daughter's bedroom with a tire iron across his knees and tried to remember how to pray. He didn't sleep. Around 3 in the morning, Mara did, with her cheek against the bedspread and her hand still around the kitchen knife, and he watched her breathe and was grateful for it. He listened to the night for the sounds that did not belong in it. Twice more, things walked past in the dark. Once, something large flew low enough that the windows shook in their frames. He kept his hand on Leela's ankle through the blanket the whole time, lightly, the way you keep a hand on a sleeping animal to know it is still sleeping. The radio, when he turned it on at dawn with the volume so low he had to put his ear against the speaker, told him 3 things. First, that the National Guard had engaged the Vesh outside of Denver, and the engagement had lasted, by the announcer's estimate, 4 minutes. Second, that the president had been moved to a location which would not be disclosed. Third, that any citizen capable of bearing arms should consider themselves activated. He turned the radio off and sat for a long time with his palms flat on his thighs. Then he got up and went into the garage. His father's rifle was on the high shelf above the workbench, in a case he had not opened in 11 years. The box of ammunition behind it was older than his daughter. He brought both down and set them on the workbench under the bare bulb and stood looking at them. He could hear, very faintly, the sound of his wife moving in the kitchen, the familiar sound of the coffee pot being filled at the sink, the smaller sound of his daughter laughing at something, sleepy and uncomprehending, a laugh that did not yet know what kind of morning it was. He opened the case. The rifle was a bolt-action Remington, a dear gun, nothing brave. He cleaned it slowly because his hands needed something slow to do. He thought about the thing in the street the night before, the sound of its many legs, the size of the shadow the ship had thrown over his yard, and he thought about a dear rifle, and he laughed once short, without any pleasure in it at all. Then he loaded the rifle and put it by the door. The first 3 days were a kind of held breath. The Vesh did not come into the small towns yet. They were busy elsewhere, and the small towns were small. Daniel and Mara stayed inside with the curtains drawn and the lights off after dark, and they listened to the radio in the early mornings, and the news got worse the way bad news always gets worse, in increments, until the increments were a slope and the slope was a cliff and the cliff was the country going over it. Boston was gone. Then half of Boston was gone. The announcer corrected himself, voice cracking, and Daniel understood that the correction was generous. Houston, Atlanta. Then the announcer was gone too, mid-sentence, and the station went to a tone, and the tone went to silence, and Daniel turned off the radio and did not turn it back on for 2 days. On the 4th day, a man named Hollies from down the road came up the driveway on foot with a shotgun across his back and a piece of paper in his hand. Hollies was 64, and he had been a Marine in a war that was now history, and he had never once in his life knocked on Daniel's door before. He knocked on it now, and Daniel let him in, and Mara made coffee with the last of the coffee, and Hollies sat at the kitchen table and unfolded the piece of paper. It was a hand-drawn map of the county. "We're getting organized," Hollies said, quiet-like. "There's about 40 of us so far. We need a medic." Daniel looked at the map. He looked at Hollies. He looked at the window where his daughter was visible in the side yard, crouched in the grass, talking to a ladybug she had cupped in both hands. 40 of us, he said, against that. Hollies took a long pull of the coffee and set the cup down with great care. "Son," he said, "I was at the Chasen Reservoir's grandchild of a war, and I have seen what a man with a dear rifle and a bad attitude can do to an army that thinks it has already won. That is not nothing. That has never been nothing." He tapped the map with one yellowed nail. "They came down here looking for cities. They didn't find any. So they're going to start looking for whatever is in between the cities, and what's in between the cities is us. I would like to be ready when they get here. I would like you to be ready with us." Daniel was quiet a long time. "I'm a medic," he said finally. "I'm not a soldier." "I'm not asking you to be a soldier," Hollies said. "I am asking you to be a medic for soldiers. There is going to be a difference, and we are going to need both." Daniel looked at Mara. Mara looked at him. She did not nod and she did not shake her head. She looked at him the way she had looked at him 11 years ago in a hospital waiting room when the doctor had said the word miscarriage for the first time, which was the look she gave him when there were no good choices, and she wanted him to know she would walk with him into whichever bad one he chose. He folded the map back up and handed it to Holly's. "Where?" he said. That was how it started. Not with a battle, not with a speech, with a folded paper map and a cup of bad coffee and a 64-year-old Marine who refused, on principle, to be afraid in his own kitchen. The Vesh, for their part, were not unintelligent. They were, in fact, more intelligent than humans in most of the ways that intelligence could be measured. Their language was musical and recursive and contained tenses for things human language did not have words for. Their ships were grown, not built. Their weapons used principles that human physics had not yet stumbled into. They had crossed a distance that human ships could not yet cross, on a timeline human minds could not yet hold, for a reason that was, from their point of view, perfectly reasonable. Their homeworld was dying. They needed a new one. This one would do. The species already on it was an obstacle, in the way that the trees on the lot are an obstacle to the foundation of the house. But there is a thing that happens to a species that has crossed the stars, and the Vesh had it badly. They had forgotten what it felt like to lose. They had not lost in 12,000 of their years. Their warriors trained against simulations because their warriors had no real enemies left. They had come down onto the surface of Earth expecting, at most, a clean afternoon's work. Their initial sweeps had supported this expectation. The cities had fallen quickly. The militaries of the major powers had been outmatched on every axis that the Vesh measured. But the Vesh measured the axes the Vesh knew about. They did not measure the others. They did not have a word in any of their 17 languages for stubborn. They had a word for brave and a word for clever and a word for desperate, but they did not have a word for a thing that knows it has lost and keeps fighting anyway, not because it expects to win, but because not fighting is, to it, a worse fate than dying. This was a hole in the Vesh dictionary. They were going to learn it the long way. The one who was going to teach them, though she did not know it yet, was a young Vesh soldier of the 3rd tier whose proper name in her own language was a long musical phrase that meant, approximately, "she who sings at the edge of the pool." She would, in time, allow Daniel Reyes to shorten it to Kel. She was 19 of her own years, which was somewhere on the order of 26 of his. She was a scout. Her drop pod was supposed to insert her into a forested region in the central part of the continent, and remain there with her for a routine 72-hour observation cycle, while her superiors planned the next phase of the campaign. The pod was supposed to come down softly. The pod did not come down softly. Something on this planet, an updraft, an old radar installation cycling in error, no one would ever quite be sure, caused her descent profile to deviate by 9 degrees in the final 8 seconds of her approach, and she came down through the canopy of a pine forest at a speed her pod was not designed to survive, and her pod broke apart around her. And she was thrown clear of it into the moss with 3 of her ribs cracked, and 1 of her 4 arms unresponsive, and her translator unit in pieces, somewhere she could not see. When she came back to consciousness, it was dawn, and a human was standing over her. He was holding a rifle. The rifle was pointed at her face. She did not speak any of his languages. She had been trained before deployment in basic recognition of human expressions, and she could see in his that he had been awake for a long time and was very afraid, and that the fear in him was not the fear of an animal but the fear of a thinking being making a choice. She knew in that moment what the choice was. She had seen humans do it on the orbital feeds. The barrel of the rifle was very close. She closed her 4 eyes. She thought in her own language the small ritual phrase her creche mother had taught her for the moment before a death, which was a phrase that meant, "I was here. I was here. The pool remembers." The shot did not come. She opened her eyes. The human was still standing over her, but he had lowered the rifle. He was looking at the place where her broken arm met her shoulder, where the pale violet of her blood had run down through the moss and was drying tacky on her undersuit. His face had changed. It was doing a thing she did not recognize at first and then did. He was looking at the wound. He set the rifle down on the moss slowly, as if he was afraid she would startle. He took something off his belt. He held it up so that she could see it. It was a small white cross on a red square. She did not then know what that symbol meant. She would learn. He came closer. He knelt. He said something to her in a low, even voice, and the words meant nothing to her, but the shape of the voice meant something. It was the voice you used on a hurt animal. It was the voice you used on a child who had fallen. He reached very slowly for her broken arm. She flinched. He stopped. He waited. He said the words again, the same shape, the same low voice. After a long moment, she let him touch her. He set the arm. It hurt in a way she had not been trained for, a hot, wet pain that ran all the way up into the back of her skull, and she made a sound she had not made since she was very small, and the human did not stop and did not flinch and did not speak. He worked. When the arm was set, he wrapped it tightly with strips of cloth he tore from his own shirt. He cleaned the long scrape down the side of her face with water from a flask. He looked again at the wound on her shoulder, and he frowned, and he made a small, thoughtful sound, and then he reached into the bag at his hip and took out a needle and a length of thread. She watched him sew her shut. When he was done, he sat back on his heels and he looked at her for a long time, and she looked at him. Neither of them said anything because neither of them could. The sun came up properly through the pines and the moss steamed a little. A bird sang somewhere. She did not know the name of the bird. She did not, then, know that the bird had a name in a language other than the music of her own people. She would learn that too. The human said one more thing in his low voice. It sounded to her like he was speaking to himself. Then he stood up and he picked up his rifle, and he held out his other hand to her, palm up and open and empty. She looked at the hand. Slowly, with the arm that still worked, she took it. He brought her back through the woods in the long way, the careful way, watching the sky. He brought her into a barn on the back of his property where he had cleared out the hay from one stall and laid down a tarp and a folded blanket. He gave her water from a jug that tasted strange to her, full of minerals her body had not encountered before. He sat with her on the floor of the barn and he ate a piece of bread slowly, and he tore off a piece and offered it to her. And when she would not take it, he put it down on the blanket near her hand and did not push. After a while she took the bread. It tasted of something she had no word for. Later she would learn the word was yeast, and the bread was sourdough, and his wife had made it 3 days before from a starter she had kept alive for 9 years. Later she would learn many things. In the moment, in the dim of the barn, she only knew that the bread was warm in her mouth, and that the human was watching her eat it with a kind of careful attention that was not the attention of a captor. He pointed at himself, Daniel. She understood. She tried to make the sound her own throat could not quite make, Daniel. He smiled. It was the first smile she had ever seen on a human face from less than a meter away. It changed his whole face. It was a thing she would think about later, when she was alone, when she was trying to explain to herself what had happened to her in the woods. She pointed at herself. She sang her name, the long musical phrase. It took most of a minute. He blinked. He tried to repeat it. He failed entirely. He laughed an apologetic laugh, and she found, to her enormous surprise, that she did not mind being laughed at by him. He tried again. He failed again. He held up his hands in surrender. He pointed at her and made a small questioning sound. Kel, she said after a moment. It was the first syllable of her name. It was an offering. Kel, he said. Okay, Kel. That was how they met. There were no witnesses to it. The story would, in much later years, be told and retold and embellished and turned into things it had not actually been. But there were no witnesses to the moment in the moss when a man with a deer rifle and a medic's bag had to make a choice. And the choice he made was the choice that would, eventually, change the war. Hollis did not approve. "You brought a vesh into your barn," he said. He said it flatly, with no inflection, the way a man says a thing he cannot yet believe he is saying. "Daniel, you brought a vesh into your barn, while your daughter is asleep in the house 20 yards away. She's hurt. It's hurt. She—" Hollis looked at him a long moment. Then he looked at Mara, who was standing in the kitchen door with her arms crossed and her jaw set, and Mara, very slightly, lifted her chin. Hollis breathed out through his nose. He was a man who had been a Marine, and he had a Marine's understanding of the orders of magnitude of a bad idea, and he was looking at one now, and he also understood, because he was not a stupid man, that the bad idea was not going to be argued out of its mind. "You understand," Hollis said carefully, "that if this gets out, there are people in our group who will want to put a bullet in her, and then probably in you. Then it can't get out. Daniel. Then it can't get out, Hollis." The old Marine was quiet a while. "What do you think you're going to do with it?" he said finally. "With her? What is the plan? Tell me there is a plan." Daniel rubbed his face with both hands. He had not slept properly in 5 days. He did not have a plan. He had a hurt creature in his barn and a wife who had decided, somehow in the course of the morning, that the hurt creature was going to stay, and a daughter who did not yet know any of this and could not be allowed to know it. And he had, at the bottom of all of it, the thing he could not yet say out loud, which was that he had looked at that face in the moss and lowered the rifle because the face in the moss had looked back at him afraid, and afraid was a thing he understood. And shooting a thing that was afraid had stopped being something he could do somewhere outside a town called Sangin in 2009. "I'm going to keep her alive," he said. "And we're going to learn to talk to her, and we're going to find out what she knows." Hollis considered this. "That last part," he said, "is the only part that sounds like a plan." "I know." "All right. All right. All right." Hollis picked up his hat from the table and put it on. "She's your responsibility. If she so much as twitches wrong, that's on you. If she has any way to call them down on us, and you'd better find out if she does fast, that is on you. And if my people find out before we have something useful out of her, that is going to be on you also. Are we clear?" "We're clear." Hollis paused at the door. He turned back. He looked at Mara again and at Daniel. "For what it's worth," he said, "in 1968 I shot a 14-year-old kid in a rice paddy because he had a rifle, and the rifle turned out to be a length of bamboo, and I have not stopped thinking about it in 57 years. So I am not going to tell you today that you made the wrong call in those woods. I am only going to tell you that the cost of making the right call is sometimes higher than you can pay. Now you find out what she knows." He left. The screen door banged behind him. Mara crossed the kitchen and put her arms around Daniel from behind, and rested her forehead between his shoulder blades, and did not say anything for a long time. It took 11 days to teach Kel enough English to ask her the first real question. It took another 4 to believe her answer. She learned fast, faster than Daniel had any right to expect. She had a memory that worked differently than his. She could hold a list of 40 words after hearing them once, and she could replay a sentence back to him with the cadence intact even when she did not yet know what the words meant. And she could, by the end of the first week, follow a slow conversation about the weather and the barn cat and the brand of bread Mara baked. She could not say his daughter's name yet, because the consonants in Leela were a shape her mouth had not been built for, and so she called Leela by a soft musical phrase of her own that meant, as best as she could explain it later, small bright thing. Leela, when she was finally allowed into the barn on the 9th day, with very explicit instructions about which parts of the situation she could and could not tell her friends, had accepted the situation with the kind of unblinking pragmatism that 8-year-olds reserve for things adults find impossible. Leela had walked up to Kel, who was sitting on the blanket with her good arm folded under her broken one, and Leela had said, You're purple. Yes, Kel had said slowly, having learned the word that morning. That's pretty, Leela had said. It was the first compliment Kel had received from a member of a species she had been sent to help eradicate. She did not, then, know how to respond to it. She would think about it also for a long time afterward. By the end of the second week, she was eating Mara's bread 3 times a day and helping, awkwardly, with her good arm, to peel potatoes at the kitchen table while Leela did long division homework that no longer had a school to go back to. She had learned the words for grief and for soup and for sorry. She had learned that Daniel's daughter was the same age as her own creche sister, and that her creche sister was now, somewhere above this planet, in a ship that had been told to find her and had not yet succeeded. She had learned that Daniel had killed people in another war, and that he did not like to talk about it, and that he had also saved more people than he had killed, and that he did not like to talk about that either. She had learned that the bread was made from a starter that Mara fed with flour and water every morning, and that the starter was older than the daughter, and that this was, somehow, important to Mara in a way that Kel was beginning to understand. On the 15th day in the barn, with the door closed and Holly sitting on an overturned bucket with his shotgun across his knees and his face very serious, Daniel asked her the first real question. Kel, he said, how do we beat you? She was quiet a long time. You don't, she said finally. Kel, I am not saying it to hurt you. I am saying it because it is what we were told. We were told there would be resistance and that the resistance would not matter. We were told the surface would be cleared in 40 of our days, which is, she did the math on her fingers, the 4 fingers of her good hand, 60 of yours. We were told to expect no casualties beyond accidents. How many of your days has it been? 11. How is the schedule holding? She looked at him. Badly, she said. Holly sat forward on the bucket. Kel, Holly said, tell us about the badly. She told them in her careful new English, that the Vesh had been losing ships at a rate the planners had not modeled for, and that the ships they were losing were not being lost to human weapons mostly, but to mistakes. A transport that had set down in a swamp and been unable to lift again, a strike group that had pursued a militia unit into a city and been ambushed in a parking garage by men with hunting rifles firing down through the concrete from 3 floors up. A forward command post that had been hit, somehow, by a single human in a crop-dusting aircraft full of homemade incendiary at 4 o'clock in the morning. She told them that her own commanders did not understand why the schedule was slipping, because her own commanders were measuring the war by the metrics the Vesh used to measure war, and the metrics the Vesh used to measure war did not include a column for a man with a deer rifle and a bad attitude. They thought, she said, you would surrender when the cities fell. The model said you would surrender when the cities fell. The model has been used before, on 3 other worlds. It worked on all 3. What happened on the 3 other worlds? Daniel said. She told him. He was quiet a long time. Mara, who had come out to the barn with a thermos of coffee and stayed for the conversation, set the thermos down on the workbench without pouring any. All right, Holly said, all right. Kel, I am going to ask you something now that you do not have to answer, and if you do not answer I will understand. But I am going to ask, how do we beat you? She looked at the floor of the barn. She looked at her own broken arm in its sling. She looked at the wall where Daniel had hung a horseshoe a long time ago, for luck, in a tradition she did not understand and that he had never quite been able to explain. There is a frequency, she said. Our ships speak to each other on it. It is the way our pilots feel each other in the formation. It is not a thing they can turn off. It is part of how the ships fly. She paused. If you put noise on it, the right noise, the formations come apart. The pilots, we are not built for being alone in a ship. We do not fly alone. We fly together or we fall. How much noise? Holly said. Not much. A few of your watts, but on the right frequency, and from many places at once, so that we cannot find the source and burn it." She looked up. "It would not win the war, but it would stop the sweeps, and the sweeps are what we are using to find the towns." "Why are you telling us this?" Daniel said quietly. She looked at him. Her 4 eyes were wet in a way he had not seen them be wet before. "Because you sewed up my arm," she said, "and gave me bread, and your daughter said I was pretty, and I have been thinking about it, Danielle. I have been thinking about it for 11 days, and I do not want you to be the third world. I do not want you to be the fourth. I do not want my people to do this anymore. I do not. I do not." She put her good hand over her face and made a sound he had not heard her make before, and did not need a translator to understand. Mara crossed the barn and sat down on the blanket beside her and put an arm around her shoulders, very carefully, mindful of the sling, and Kel leaned into her, and the two of them sat there in the dim of the barn, and Hollis took his hat off slowly and held it in his lap. After a long time, Hollis cleared his throat. "Daniel," he said, "I think we're going to need a radio. There is a thing that happens, sometimes in a war, that the histories do not record because the histories do not know how to record it. It is not a battle, and it is not a treaty, and it is not a famous speech. It is the long sequence of small, ordinary days during which a thing that was impossible becomes a thing that is merely difficult, and then a thing that is merely difficult becomes a thing that is being done. Those 11 days were that sequence. In the mornings, Mara would come out to the barn before light with a tin cup of warm broth, because Kel could keep down broth before her stomach would tolerate the heavier things, and Kel would drink it with her good hand wrapped all the way around the cup the way a child does, and she would sit very still while Mara checked the dressing on her shoulder, and she would say, in her careful new English, "Thank you, Mara," and Mara would say nothing at all but would put her hand briefly on top of Kel's head. The way she had put her hand on Leela's head 1,000 mornings of 1,000 other lives. Kel had no equivalent gesture in her own people's customs. She did not yet understand it. She understood only that it meant something, and that she was being given the something on purpose, and that she did not want it to stop. In the afternoons, Hollis came. Hollis was the hardest of them for her. He sat on the overturned bucket with his shotgun across his knees, and he asked her questions for an hour at a time, about troop dispositions, about command structure, about the names of officers and the locations of forward bases and the protocols by which lost scouts were retrieved. He asked them flatly, without warmth, the way a man interrogates a prisoner he has not yet decided is a prisoner. She answered him slowly with the words she had. She did not lie to him. She had decided, on the second day, that she would not lie to him, because lying to him would have been a small betrayal of the thing Daniel had done in the moss, and she was not going to betray that thing, not for the schedule, not for the planners, not for the homeworld she had been sent to make this one resemble. Hollis, for his part, did not warm to her, but by the 7th day he had begun, without remarking on it, to bring her things from the house, a wool blanket on a cold morning, a piece of dried apple, once a paperback Western from his own shelf that he had set on the workbench without explanation, and without ever in subsequent conversation mentioning. Kel could not read the Western. She had not yet learned to read at all. But she had understood the paperback for what it was, and she had kept it under her pillow, and she had thought about it at night when she could not sleep. In the evenings Leela came. Leela was, in some ways, the most dangerous of them, because Leela had no model for what Kel was supposed to be, and so was making one up from scratch, and the model she was making up was a model in which Kel was a tall purple person with 4 eyes who had hurt her arm and was staying in the barn until she felt better. Leela brought her drawings. Leela brought her, on the 5th day, a wildflower in a jelly jar with the lid screwed back on, because Leela had not been sure whether Kel was the kind of creature for whom a flower needed water or air or both, and had decided to be safe about it. Leela asked her questions Hollis would not have thought to ask. Leela asked her whether the stars looked the same from her home as from here. Leela asked her whether she had a mother. Leela asked her, on the 9th day, whether she was scared. Yes, Kel said. Of what? Kel had to think about it, then she said, of going back. Leela considered this gravely, swinging her legs on the workbench. Then don't, she said. It was the kind of answer that only an 8-year-old can give, and that only an 8-year-old can mean, and Kel had thought about it for a long time after Leela had gone back to the house for dinner, and she had decided quietly, in the way that the largest decisions in a life are sometimes made, that the 8-year-old was right. Outside the barn, the war was happening. Daniel did not bring it inside. He came back from his nights out with Hollies and the others with mud on his boots, and the particular thinness around his eyes that she had begun to recognize as his exhaustion, and he washed his hands at the pump for a long time before he came into the barn, and when he came in he did not speak about it. She did not ask. She knew enough to know that what they were doing out there was the small, careful work of people who had decided, against the odds and against the schedule, to be in the way of a thing much bigger than they were. And she knew what that work cost, because she had seen it costed on the orbital feeds, and she did not need him to tell her any more than the mud on his boots had already told her. Once, on the 8th night, he came in late and sat down on the floor of the barn across from her blanket and did not say anything for a long time. There was a darkness across the front of his shirt that she eventually understood was not mud. He had washed his hands, but he had forgotten about the shirt. Danielle, she said quietly. I know, he said. He pulled the shirt away from his skin. It's not mine, it's not mine. Whose? He looked at her a moment. He weighed something behind his eyes. A man named Carl, he said. From 2 roads over. He had a granddaughter Leela's age. The granddaughter is fine. Carl is not. We were going to a house that anyway, he's not. She was quiet. I am sorry, Danielle. Yeah, me too. Is it because of what we are doing? To get ready, the radios. No, he said. No, Kel, it is because of what your people are doing. Don't take that one. That one is not yours to take. She looked at him a long moment in the dim of the barn. I will take some of it, she said carefully. I think I will take some of it. I do not think you get to tell me which parts. He looked back at her. After a moment he smiled, a small tired smile that did not reach the rest of his face, and he nodded once. All right, he said, fair. He got up, he went to the house. She heard, through the barn wall, the sound of the back door opening, and the sound of his wife meeting him in the kitchen, and the sound of his wife saying something in a low voice, and then not saying anything else for a long time, which was the sound, Kel was beginning to understand, of 2 people who had loved each other long enough to do the hardest part of the loving in silence. She lay down on the blanket that night with the paperback Western under her pillow and her broken arm aching the way it did at night when the air was damp. And she thought about Carl, whom she had never met and would not now meet, and about the granddaughter who was fine, and about her own crushed sister in the ship above this planet, and about the long line of consequences that ran out from every choice she had not yet made, and she made one of them. She made the choice quietly, in her own head, in her own language, with the small ritual phrase that her creche mother had taught her a long time ago for the moments that mattered. She did not say it out loud. She did not need to. She knew, by then, that Daniel would not have needed to hear it to know it had been made. The next morning, at the workbench with Hollies and Devon and a feed store calendar, she began, without being asked, to sketch the frequency. They needed more than a radio. They needed 40 radios. They needed 40 radios in 40 different places, broadcasting on a frequency that none of them had ever broadcast on before, with a kind of noise none of them yet knew how to make, and they needed it before the Vesh decided to come sweep the woods in earnest, which Kel estimated would happen in approximately 9 of his days. They had 9 days. They got 11. Because the Vesh paused for 2 of them to reorganize after losing a frigate somewhere outside St. Louis, to a thing nobody on the ground had figured out yet, but which would later turn out to have involved a retired air traffic controller, 3 teenagers with a drone, and a quantity of stolen propane that the official reports would politely fail to itemize. The Vesh had begun, in their internal communications, to use a word that did not exist in their language and that they had had to make up on the fly. It translated, roughly, as anomaly rate exceeding model. It was being used by the end of those 11 days with increasing frequency. It was being used in the highest circles of the Vesh command, in tones that were not yet panic but were no longer confidence. Daniel did not know about any of that, of course. Daniel knew about his own county and the 4 counties next to it, and the slow, careful work of riding out to 40 different farmhouses on a horse Hollies had produced from somewhere, because trucks could be tracked from orbit but a horse could not, and explaining to 40 different farmers what was needed, and why, and how, and the careful work after that of teaching 40 different farmers to build from the radios they already owned. The small, simple noisemakers Kel had described to him in 3 afternoons of patient sketching on the back of a feed store calendar. It was not a sophisticated device. A teenager with a soldering iron could build one. They had several teenagers. The teenagers proved, in fact, to be unreasonably good at it. The teenagers, freed from school and from the part of the future that had been taken away from them, had become quietly, fiercely useful in a way Daniel had not expected and would not, in later years, ever forget. On the 10th day, Kel walked out of the barn for the first time. She walked with her good arm around Daniel's shoulders to the back porch, and she sat down on the steps next to Leela, and she watched the sun go down over the pines. Her bad arm was healing. The translator unit, painstakingly reassembled from its broken pieces by Hollies' grandson, who turned out to be the best of the teenagers with a soldering iron, a 15-year-old named Devin who could not, in normal times, be persuaded to do his algebra homework, was on her lap, blinking quietly. She did not need it any more for the simple words. She wanted it for the hard ones. "Kel," Leela said, "when the sky opens up again, will it be your people coming for you?" "Yes," Kel said. "Will they take you home?" "They will take me," Kel said carefully, "for a trial. For what I am about to do, I will not be going home." Leela considered this with the gravity she reserved for very serious things. "That's not fair," she said. "No," Kel said, "it is not." "Daddy," Leela said without looking up, "is there a way for it to be fair?" Daniel was sitting on the porch railing with his hands hanging between his knees. He looked at his daughter. He looked at Kel. He looked at the long red horizon over the pines, where, in the morning, the sky was probably going to open up again. "I don't know, baby," he said. "We're going to try." That night at 2 in the morning, on a frequency that 38,000 kilometers of empty air separated from the nearest Vesh ear, 40 radios in 40 farmhouses across 4 counties came on at the same time, and they began to sing. The noise they made was not loud, in the way a radio is loud. It was the kind of small, sustained chord that a hurt animal makes in the back of its throat, a thing pitched between 2 notes that should not have been near each other and that did not, when they were near each other, want to stay. It was a noise that Kel had hummed for Daniel in the barn 3 afternoons before, while Hollies recorded it on his phone with the careful concentration of a man, recording the only copy of a thing the world was going to need. It was the sound of a Vesh in mourning. It was the sound the Vesh made in their creches when one of them died. It was the one sound, Kel had told him, that no Vesh pilot in any formation could hear and continue flying as if nothing had happened. It was the one frequency they had never thought to shield against, because no human had ever been supposed to know it existed. When the sun came up the next morning, the sweeps had stopped. They did not start again, not that day, not the next. By the 3rd day, the Vesh command was holding emergency sessions in the orbital flagship, and the word anomaly rate exceeding model had been replaced in the official communications, with a word that was harder to translate, but that meant, roughly, we do not understand what they are. By the 5th day, the first Vesh ship lifted from the surface of Earth on its way home. By the 7th day, 3 more had followed. By the 10th day, the orbital flagship itself was gone, and the sky over the pines had gone back to being only sky, and the long bright seam had closed for the last time, and the war that was not supposed to last more than 60 of Daniel Reyes's days had ended in 28. The Vesh had lost. They had lost because they had measured the wrong things. They had lost because they had a word for clever, and a word for brave, and a word for desperate. But they did not have a word for a man with a deer rifle and a bad attitude. And they did not have a word for a woman who kept a sourdough starter alive for 9 years through 3 moves and a recession and a war. And they did not have a word for an 8-year-old who looked at a wounded enemy in her father's barn and said, "You're purple. That's pretty." They had lost because the species they had come to clear from the surface of this planet was a species that, when it found a thing in the moss with 4 eyes and a broken arm, did not always shoot. They had lost because one of their own scouts, sewn up in a barn and given bread by a stranger, had decided in 11 days that she did not want to be the third world anymore. She did not go with them when they left. She could not have, even if she had wanted to. The trial she had described to Leela on the porch was not something she was prepared to walk into, and her people, the ones who had come for her at the very end in a small ship that landed in the pasture behind the church, had understood when she had refused that something had happened to her on this planet that they did not yet have the language to name. They had not forced her. They had left her there in the pasture, with her good hand raised in a gesture that was the closest her people had to farewell. And the ship had gone up into the sky, and the sky had closed behind it for the last time, and Kel had walked back across the pasture to where Daniel and Mara and Leela were standing at the edge of the trees. Leela ran out to meet her. Kel knelt awkwardly with her arm still in its sling, and Leela threw both her own arms around Kel's neck and held on, and Kel, after a moment, put her good arm around the small girl and held on back. "You can stay," Leela said into the side of Kel's neck. "You can stay with us." "I can stay," Kel said. It was very nearly the end of the story. It was not the end of the story. The end of the story came later, in the long, quiet years that followed, when the country slowly put itself back together, and the world slowly put itself back together, and the small towns that had survived because they were small towns slowly remembered that they were also where the people lived. Kel stayed. She lived in the small back bedroom that had been Daniel's office before the war and was, after, Kel's room. She helped Mara with the garden in the spring and with the canning in the fall, and she learned, eventually, to pronounce Leela's name properly, with a softness in the L that no other Vesh tongue had ever managed. She helped Holly's grandson Devon, who turned out to have a head for languages no one had previously suspected, to begin work on the first proper Vesh English dictionary, a project that would, by the time Devon was a grown man with children of his own, become the standard reference at 3 different universities. She did not ever go back to her own people. She wrote them letters, in the long musical phrases of her own language, on paper that Mara helped her press from the pulp of last year's bills, and she sent them up into the sky on a small repurposed weather balloon every spring, which was a thing that could not possibly have worked and which she did anyway, and which Daniel never once teased her for because he understood by then what it was for. There is a photograph somewhere, in the front room of a farmhouse on a dirt road in a county that the maps have mostly forgotten, of 4 people standing on a porch in the long light of an early autumn. There is a man with gray in his beard now, leaning on a porch railing, with a daughter at his elbow who is no longer 8 years old, and a wife beside him with flour still on her wrist from the morning's bread. And there is, between the wife and the daughter, a tall figure in a knitted shawl whose face is pale violet, whose 4 eyes are closed in the soft light, whose good arm is around the shoulders of the small girl no longer small beside her, and whose other arm, the one that was broken in a forest 23 years before, hangs a little stiff at her side, the way an old injury will, the way the body keeps the record of the things it has survived. The photograph is not famous. Most of the things that mattered most about the war are not famous. The famous things were the speeches afterward and the treaties afterward, and the names of the cities that came back, and those things were real and they mattered and they belonged in the books. But the thing that won the war was the thing in that photograph, and the thing in that photograph was never going to fit in a book, because the thing in that photograph was not a strategy or a weapon or a doctrine. It was a man who had set down a rifle in some moss. It was a wife who had said, with her chin, "Yes, bring her inside." It was a daughter who had said, "You're purple, that's pretty." It was a Marine who had taken his hat off in a barn and said, "I think we are going to need a radio." It was a scout, 19 of her own years and very far from home, who had thought she was about to die in a forest on a planet she had been sent to clear, and had closed her 4 eyes, and had waited for the shot that did not come, and had opened her eyes again to find a stranger looking at her wound instead of her face. That was the thing. That was the whole thing. The Vesh had crossed the stars and they had grown their ships and they had measured 1,000 species against the metrics of their long, undefeated history, and they had missed the one metric that mattered, which was this: that there is a kind of creature in this universe that, when it finds a hurt thing in the moss, will lower the rifle. There is a kind of creature in this universe that will, even after everything, even on the worst morning of its worst week of its worst year, even with its sky split open and its cities gone, and its hands shaking on the stock of a dear rifle that was never going to be enough. There is a kind of creature in this universe that will look at a face and see, in it, fear and will, on the strength of that single recognition, make a different choice than the one it was given. We are that kind of creature. Not all of us, not always, not even most of the time, depending on the year and the country and the kind of day a man has had, but enough of us, enough of the time, enough in the end to matter, enough to bring down a fleet that had not lost in 12,000 years. Enough to send the Vesh home in their grown ships full of a word they had not previously had, the word that Kel had taught them in the only way a word like this can be taught, which is by being it, in front of them, until they could not pretend any longer that it was not real. The word in their language now is the long musical phrase she sang for Leela one evening on the porch, in the long red light, the year she finally agreed to let Holly's grandson record it for the dictionary. It is the longest entry in the Vesh English book, because it could not be shortened without losing what it meant. It takes most of a minute to say properly. It is the word in Vesh for what a human does sometimes when a human finds a wounded enemy in the moss. The closest translation in our language is mercy. But it is not quite that. It is something a little stranger than that and a little harder. It is the word for the choice itself. It is the word for the lowering of the rifle. It is the word for the moment in the moss before anything else, when a man looks at a face and decides what kind of creature he is going to be. We are that kind of creature. The Vesh know it now. So do we. And in a small back bedroom that used to be an office, in a farmhouse on a dirt road in a county that the maps have mostly forgotten, on a quiet night in the long quiet years that followed, a tall figure with 4 eyes and a stiff arm sits up against the pillows with a paperback western on her knees, and reads it slowly by the light of a lamp Mara left burning in the hall, and turns the pages with the careful concentration of a creature who has, against all of her training and against all of her orders, and against every metric her people had ever used to measure the worth of a world, chosen to stay. That is the ending, there is no other.